Hello and welcome to Season 3 of the All Nations Church podcast. I'm James Aubrey and I'm joined by my good friends Dave Patterson.
Hello.
And Kier Adams.
Hello.
We are so excited to be with you again. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for tuning in or downloading or streaming or however you listen to us. But we are back for Season 3, which we have called We Could Be Heroes.
Woo.
That was a good little whoop, guys.
It was almost there was a bit of a harmony going on there.
It was.
You can feel the excitement in the room.
We didn't even practice that.
No.
So the theme of this series, Season 3, is that we're going to be talking with various members of our church family to learn basically about some of our spiritual heroes.
Yeah.
So we're very, very excited. Each week we're going to be joined by a different friend of ours from the church who's going to be sharing with us someone who's inspired them from the recent Christian past, and we're going to kind of hear about their life story, and we're going to ask them plenty of questions, and we're going to talk about some of the things that we can learn about their lives today. But Dave was pretty insistent that he had to be the first guest on the show, wasn't he, Kier?
I'm not sure I remember that conversation.
Okay, no, I might have slightly exaggerated that.
James insisted that you...
Yes, I think that's a better way of putting it. I may well have insisted. So today we're really thrilled actually that our special guest is none other than Dave Patterson.
Wow.
Hey.
And Dave's going to be talking with us about one of his spiritual heroes. So Dave, who are we talking about today?
Today we are going to be talking about Mr. Rees Howells.
Mr. Rees Howells. Okay, well, introduce us to Rees Howells, Dave. Who was he? When was he alive, and what's he known for?
Well, I think, first of all, my father-in-law is going to be really excited that I, an Englishman, have come to live in Wales, and I've chosen my spiritual hero to talk about, a Welshman from Carmarthenshire. So Rees Howells was born late 19th century, 1879. He was born in the Carmarthenshire town of Brynaman. I think I'm pronouncing that right.
Say it with confidence,
We've
Dave.
gone for it.
Yeah.
Brynaman, and he was born into a kind of traditional Welsh life. Quite a poor family. There was a mining economy in his area and a tin economy as well. And so he kind of grew up in this kind of working class life. But one of the reasons that he's my hero is that God can use absolutely anyone, and he does. And so from his life in this village, he gets caught up in the call of God, and he saw many people's lives change, particularly through the power of prayer. The name of the book that we'll look at today and that I read several years ago for the first time is called Intercessor by a gentleman called Norman Grubb, and that's really what Rees Howells is known for, his power in intercession and the things that he saw come about through that.
So his dates, if he's born in 1879, then he experienced the Welsh Revival, didn't he, in 1904?
He did, yes.
He was, he actually, correct me if I'm wrong, I think he became a Christian in America, didn't he? Although he grew up kind of in kind of chapel in Wales, he went over to the States in his early 20s, had a kind of a religious conversion. I think while he was sick, I think he had typhoid. Yeah. And then he moved back to Wales. He returns to Wales actually in 1904, I think.
Or 1905, but either way, yeah.
And he experiences the Welsh Revival that was taking place then. So how did you first come across this story? How did you first hear about Rees Howells?
So I first came across it, I think it was actually with you, James. I don't know if you remember the story, but I'd just come to university, so this is about 12 years ago. And one of the things that I really wanted to grow in my walk with God was just learning how to pray. And so I think we'd done some things together. I was reading the Bible, and I wanted to get my hands on some resources and things. So it might have been you that sent this book my way, and
I probably bought it for you in a second-hand bookshop.
Yeah, this might be that copy.
Knowing my track record,
there's a little pencil mark at the top.
You should read this.
£1.50.
Gosh, that's a lot of money.
We love hay on my. And so I read this at university when which was a really formational time. It's a formational time for many people. But particularly, I was really starting to stand on my own 2 feet in faith, wanted to follow Jesus for myself. And I suppose I described that season as a time where I was wanting to take responsibility for my walk with God and take that quite seriously, which is what I found when I started reading this book, that Rees Howells was a man who really took responsibility for his walk with God and really understood that though he wasn't necessarily a big name from a big place, that those who walk with God and take their faith seriously and really listen to the Lord and want to obey him and follow him can have a real impact on the world around them. So yeah, it was a really, really precious time.
So let's kind of think a little bit about his life story then. So we know that he obviously grew up, like you said, in Bryn Aman. He worked in a tin mill from the age of 12. He went to the States and then came back again. And his service of God begins while he's working in the mines, kind of in the local village. So kind of how did he kind of first begin stepping out and serving God, and how did he first start learning about prayer that gave him this name, Rees Howells Intercessor?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And again, it's a really encouraging story in the sense that, like you just said, he was just a guy going about his everyday life, working a normal job. So at that time, he's working 12 or 13 hours. He's getting up and leaving the house at 6 in the morning, heading down to the mine. He's working his time down the mine, and then in the evenings, he's coming back home. And he's just starting to run Bible study groups in his home. And he's just starting to pray, and he's just saying, God, what do I do? And the big thing that starts to come, that starts to get him moving in his faith, he's just aware of a down and out that's in his town. Everybody has a go at this guy. Oh, we all know so-and-so. He lost his job down the mine, all this kind of thing. He's in a real bad state. And he just felt God speak to him one day and say, I'd like you to go and reach this man. And if you'll trust me for this man, you'll be able to trust me for hundreds, thousands of people. But I want you to come alongside him. I want you to understand his pain. I want you to understand his life, and I want you to understand that as you pray and walk with this man, I'm going to use you to be a conduit of my grace towards him. And this is really the journey, and quite formational, it seems, to Mr. Howells as he's learning to follow Jesus. So he spends about 2 years in total just where this guy is part of his life regularly. So he would pray for him regularly. He would spend time with him. He would just live on the streets. He would go spend time with him in the evening, just sit with him, in his drunken stupor. And he just learned to understand this guy's life. And he just continued to pray for him, love him. He put clothes on his back. He found him some lodgings out of his own money. He put him up in a house. He would spend time in his doing Bible study with him. He brought him along to the church meetings that he was involved in. And over the course of a couple of years, just saw this guy's life totally transformed. Wow. And you think, it's just one guy going, I believe God's told me to do something. Yeah. And it's just one man in a tiny town that nobody is ever going to know anything about, but all I know is that God is interested in this one person. Yeah. And all those things were great. This guy's life is totally transformed practically, but God wanted to save him and bring him into his family. Yeah. And so that's part of this man's story. And for Rees Howells, that seems to be a really, really kind of shaping moment where where God leads him to really meet people just where they're at. And I think that was one of the big things, particularly when I first read about Rees Howells' life. He had a real encounter with Jesus, really encountered the God who laid down his life for him at the cross. Had a real strong sense of, oh my gosh, this love that God shows us was a sacrificial love that was unconditional. And really the drive of his life was to say, Lord, how can I show that love to other people around me? It's not enough just for me to hold on to it. I want to be someone who can show that love to others as well.
And where does he go from there then? So after he has led this tramp to the Lord, what else does he do in his kind of local community?
Well, that starts really something wider. So he continues to meet and pray for other people. As he's spending time on the streets, he's meeting lots of different people. And again, he really feels that God's asking him to use his own means. He says, you're just going to have to trust me, Rees, to reach these people. So he starts up, I think he uses the phrase, he starts up a mission in his hometown to the homeless. And he puts clothes on their backs. He helps them into jobs. He's got a good relationship with the managers of the mine that he works at and with the other businesses around. And he just starts to try and help these guys back on their feet. And as he's doing so, friends that he's made over the years, people that have been around in the revival that kind of want to still be involved in the work that God's been doing in Wales, start to join him, and this thing starts to grow. And it kind of starts to draw a bit of national attention. Yeah. So he ends up speaking in different parts of the country, even gets called to London at one point just to talk about what God's been doing in Wales.
Yeah.
And things just start to kind of grow for him from there.
Quite early on, he's quite keenly aware, I think, of the cost involved in serving God, isn't he?
Mm.
You know, I think of the story, for example, of when he's told by the Lord to pray for a particular lady, not to talk to her, not to witness to her at all, but to kind of pray for her and expect her to kind of come to faith by Christmas, and she does.
Yeah.
But also there are certain kind of social and societal costs that he has to pay. So would you perhaps tell us the story about Rees Howells and his hat?
Yeah. The No Hat Brigade is
right. The No Hat Brigade.
the No Hat
that's
Brigade.
Right, yes.
That was really significant for me, actually. So we'll start here, I suppose. As a church here in Cardiff, we practice what Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 11, the uncovering and covering of your heads. And I haven't come from a church background that did that, and I came here and you kind of go, oh, it's house rules. I'll get involved. Very happy to do that. See that in the scriptures. But for me, this was a moment where I really use the phrase uncovered, or received a real understanding of the authority that we have in prayer and what God's really calling us to do. So the story goes that Rees Howells is in a season of his life where he feels God is calling him into a deeper level of prayer. He's starting to take on in prayer individuals, like you say, that lady who gets saved before Christmas, particular people who've been unwell. He's really interceding. We'll talk about that word in a minute. Really, really praying very, very deeply for these people. And he feels that God is calling him to a place where he uses the phrase to be in an attitude of prayer at all times.
Yeah.
You know, it almost resonates with Paul, where he says, I pray at all times.
Yeah.
And he feels God speak to him and say, I'd like you to take your hat off and to leave your hat off at all times, because I want you to be in a place where you can pray.
Yeah.
And in this culture and in this society, it's a really big deal. So when you leave the house, it's a mark of respect to wear a hat. A gentleman, this is, early 20th century, a gentleman wears his hat. It might be a poor community, but everybody has their pride and we do things properly. We wear our hats, and maybe we'll take them off if a funeral carriage goes by, that kind of thing. And so he feels God's called him to this, and he realised this is actually going to be a big cost, and not just for me, but for my family.
Yeah.
So he tells the story goes in the book. He's coming down the stairs for the first time to leave the house, and his mum hands him his cap, and he says, "I'm not going to need that today." And she doesn't want to let him leave the house without it. And he says, "Mum, with all that love and respect, God's asked me to pray, and I'm going to uncover my head and be in an attitude of prayer." Yeah. And I think at all times he's really aware of this. So I've just mentioned in this season he ends up being called to London. He meets with a member of the gentry. He's been asked to speak at a really kind of prestigious conference where people who've got money and influence are funding missions across the world, and they've heard about this man Rees Howells, who's doing great things in this small town in Brenhaman in Carmarthenshire, and he's going to come and speak. And he arrives in London and he gets off the train to meet this member of the gentry, and he's not wearing a hat. And this gentleman says, "With all the respect in the world, Mr. Howells, I can't be seen in you in London if you're not wearing a hat." And so they have to walk, feet apart, because this gentleman can't be seen. All the while, Rees is just says, "No, it's what God's called me to do. It's what God's called me to do, and I'm going to be in an attitude of prayer at all times." That's not necessarily something that we all have to do, but it's this: I'm going to be in an attitude of prayer towards God at all times, because I want to be used at any time.
And he another example of where he was willing to pay quite a big cost was he actually relinquished the leadership of the mission that you mentioned that he started. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, well, you think this is what he's known for. So this is his calling card. It's what. Yeah. It's not just what God is doing in him and what he's known for. It's been the really foundational part of his walk with God. Mm-hmm. But he's leading it with this other guy, and it's becoming clear that this guy wants to kind of take it on and do it himself. And there's a risk of a split. There's a risk of it falling apart. And he really feels God speak to him, something that he tries to live by for the rest of his life. He says, "I want you to live in the position of a servant. I want you to humble yourself." Mm-hmm. And if that means that you're never known for anything great, that means if somebody else comes into your town and wants to do something great, then I want you to let those people shine. And that's what he does. So he relinquishes the mission that he's established, the thing that he started, the thing that he's known for. And according to the book anyway, it goes on to be really, really successful. And Mr. Howells doesn't take the credit for that. He just praises God. I think that says a lot about him, and it speaks really very much to how God wants us to live our lives, which is to be those who celebrate one another rather than compare or try and grab from one another.
Up until this point, Rees is still living in Wales. He's still working down the mines. He is learning amazing lessons about prayer and about believing God for finance.
Yeah.
He's about to be led by God to kind of give up his job as a miner and devote himself to kind of what we would call full-time intercession. Now, the word intercession and the concept of being an intercessor is quite a big deal for Rees Howells. It's obviously the title of the biography of his that we've read. So what does Rees Howells mean by an intercessor? When he uses that word and when it's used to describe him, what is an intercessor?
Yeah, that's a really good question, James. Intercessory prayer is something that the church has done for years. It's not something that Mr. Howells invented, but like you say, it's something that he really took on very, very personally, and was something that meant something very, very specific to him. To intercede means to stand in the gap, to stand between two parties, to mediate, to represent, which in one way is what all of prayer is, to be able to kind of stand before God and as his church represent him to the world, and also to represent the needs of the world and our families, our communities to God. So there's an element of that. But for Rees, this is why I said some of his early dealings with people were very, very foundational. For him, there were three particular things that an intercessor had and would find.
Yeah.
And the first we've kind of talked about is identification.
Yeah.
So for Mr. Howells, when he felt the leading of the Holy Spirit to pray for somebody else, the first thing that he would do is try and understand that person's situation, whether it was by spending time with them or in some way trying to identify his life with them. So we talked about working with the homeless earlier. One of the things that he did, he started to eat as the homeless did, and they had, if you're a homeless person, you were relying on the welfare state, you would get 2 meals a day, very, very simple meals. So Mr. Howells started doing that, and he would find ways to identify with people, to understand them, so that he could understand what he was praying for. The second thing, the second principle for him was again in line with identification, agony. He really, like I said earlier, had a real understanding and grasp that Jesus had gone through great agony for us.
Okay.
And it was an expression of God's love to go to the cross for us.
Yeah.
And for him to go to God and to pray sometimes was to take on the agony of others and to try and understand their situation. And even in some cases, and again, this is not something that we all have to do, it's just something that he lived by. He would say, Lord, I would rather that, just like Jesus took on my sin, took on my shame, I would rather that you would give me their weight and their burden to bear myself, so that you would release this person. For him, it wasn't just, I'm just going to pray and shoot up a prayer. It was, no, I really want to walk with this person and understand their pain, even to the point of saying, Lord, I'll take it for them.
A bit like Paul, I think maybe Rees uses this analogy himself, but a bit like Paul says in Romans 10, I'd rather be accursed so that Israel could be saved.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, that kind of thing. Really, really carrying people.
Yeah. Very,
Very personal man in that sense. And for him, he believed that those things were the things that led to a place of authority.
Okay, yeah.
You've identified with someone, you're carrying their pain and their agony, and you're coming to the Lord on their behalf.
Yeah.
And it's, for him, that was, once you've understood them, you can come to the Lord and really seek his will.
Yeah.
And be able to pray those things through.
Okay, that's really helpful. And I suppose all of those principles are kind of summed up maybe in the story of his uncle, who is an invalid.
Yeah, Uncle Dick.
Yeah.
Yeah, incredible story. An invalid, been so for many, many years, but a really, really godly man, lovely man. I think Rees Howells talks about going up to his grandparents' house up the mountain from where where his uncle lived, saying it was like stepping into heaven. It's just a beautiful place. Again, a really influential man on his life. But he interceded for his uncle in this kind of way. And a really incredible story. He felt God give him the time and the day that he was going to be healed. And again, when he had this time of day and he was fasting, he was praying, he was interceding, really, really believed that God was going to give this great victory of healing. And just a week before he had this final date, there was no sign. Uncle Dick had taken a dip in health. They didn't think he was going to live, let alone be healed. There's about a week to go, and he felt God say, I'm going to take you off to this place. I'm going to take you away. Okay. So that when the healing comes, nobody's going to be able to give glory to any man. It's just going to be me. And against this humility, you think he could easily say, because it does happen, Uncle Dick gets healed, and the great testimony is he walks to church for the first time. Wow. And walks into the meeting, and it just sets off the whole meeting. So this man who everybody in this town knows. Yeah. And the word's gone out, God said he's going to be healed by this time. And you think, when you put that out, it's a do or die. This is either going to happen or it's not. And again, it's this rest that he comes to where he goes, no, I really believe that God's going to do this, so I don't need to worry. That's God's now. So he's able to go to a different part of the country and not even be there, and he hears a couple of days later that his uncle's been healed, and the guy who comes goes, isn't this amazing? He was like, yeah, but I knew it had happened already. So, he's happy, but he's not surprised. It's just an amazing man.
Yeah. And it sounds like there's in his life, and I'm sure it's something that God's cultivated in him, like you said, such a great humility that it's not like it's not about him at all, but he's also seems so confident in who God is as well. So it's not just, he's not humble as in, oh well, I don't want any recognition, and if it happens, it happens. Like he like you said, the word had got out, but there was clearly something within him which was, well, it's not my word. It's not my responsibility. I'm doing my responsibility, which is I am going to pray. Yeah. But ultimately, the result of it is God's. Yeah. And it sounds like there's something that he's really captured of the relationship we have to God, particularly within prayer and that.
Yeah. And I think I pick up on two things here. You use that word cultivation. I think it's easy to read stories of heroes or even listen to this podcast and think, man, this is all happening at the same time, and it just was all an explosion. I think when you read his story, and I think we'll find this as we listen to some other heroes across the season, is that most of these people, if not all, were people of prayer, dedicated to the quiet time and quiet place. Yeah. And a lot of these things took time. Yeah. That first man, he was in his life for years. It wasn't an overnight thing. And we praise God when those things happen. Yeah. But it was a commitment to go, God hasn't told me to do X, Y, and Z, and I'm going to go on and do 1,000. He's given me one. Yeah. Yeah. And if that's what my life is worth to God, to look after the one, then I'll do that. Yeah, yeah. And the other thing you said, Kier, it was about it being God's word. It reminds me a little bit of Elijah. Elijah kind of bursts onto the scene, but the clue to his life is in the first couple of verses of him in the scriptures, which is, as surely as the Lord lives, before whom I stand. Yeah. And you think, what has Elijah been doing? He's been standing before God. Yeah. That's what he's been doing. So we have, a short amount of his life in the scriptures. What's he been doing? He's been spending time with his Father. Yeah, yeah. And so when he says, at my word, there will be no rain, you think, whose word is that? Is that God's or Elijah's? Yes. Yeah. Because he's been standing before God, and he can stand there with complete assurance. Yeah. Because he's been spending time with him. He knows who his Father is and knows his voice. And there's something of that, I think, of Rees Howells. Yeah. Yeah.
So everything we've talked about so far has taken place for Rees Howells in South Wales, really pretty much in his hometown or the surrounding villages. But the next phase of his life, he's married at this point.
Yes.
He and his wife have a son, and they feel God calls them to Africa.
Yeah, that's right. So again, you think he's handed over the mission there, which may have seemed a great sacrifice, and it was at the time, but again, in the plans of God, it actually enabled him to be ready to to move. He'd felt for a while a leading and a stirring to go to Africa. And he went with a missionary organisation into South Africa. And again was building up to us. By this point, like you said, he was married. He had a son who they left behind in the UK with family.
That was a huge decision and a big sacrifice for him, wasn't it?
Again,
Particularly
massive.
for his wife. Just
Massive.
that decision to leave a child behind while they were on the mission field.
It's huge. I mean, I think I've said to you guys in reading this, the cost that these guys go through is absolutely incredible. They really take the scriptures at face value and say, we're going to live this.
So they go to South Africa.
So off to South Africa, and even that is quite incredible. By this point, Mr. Howells feels the Lord has spoken to him and say not to take a salary from anyone, but to trust him to be his direct provider. And so you just get really incredible stories of him getting into queues at train stations. He had enough money. The whole town's shown up to send off, this great local hero, Mr. Howells and his wife. And they're about to go off, and he doesn't tell anyone he's only got enough money to get as far as Llanelli. And they get there, and there's still people who've travelled with them from the village on the train, and they've been singing on the train. And he's thinking, man, how am I gonna get from Llanelli to London and then off to South Africa? And he gets to the train station. He feels the Lord say, "Will you just get in the line to get the ticket?" What am I going to do? I'm going to get to the desk. Look really foolish. They're getting closer and closer and closer. There's a couple of people in front when suddenly the person in front says, "Oh, I haven't got time for this. Here, take my money and go get yourself a ticket."
I've got to go to work.
I've got to go to work. And I think, what is this? But God provides. And part of them leaving behind their son Samuel, they felt God say, if you'll sow a life, you'll reap 100,000 in Africa.
Yeah.
And they go to South Africa, and they just see incredible things happen. They end up working in this missionary station. They end up traveling around South Africa, just preaching the gospel, seeing thousands of people give their lives to the Lord, encouraging missionaries out there. And they end up being there for a good few years. And just seeing absolutely incredible things happen. And
then the next thing that happens to them is quite a surprise for them, which is that God brings them back to Wales.
Yeah.
And from there, then we see the establishment of, a really kind of important, significant place for them and for the history of Christianity in Wales, which is the Bible School of Wales.
Yeah. Yeah, which again is an amazing story. I think it comes across in the book. There's almost a slight disappointment to leave Africa and all that's going on, and to come back and really, Mr. Howells feels the Lord leading him into some quiet time, into some prayer. He spends a lot of time up on the mountains, really kind of, what's happened here, if you're looking from the outside. But yeah, he starts to put it in his heart to say, I'd like you to set up not just a Bible school, but he wants to have a home for missionaries' children, so that when others go off into the field, as he and his wife had done, that they would have a place where they know their children are going to be looked after and raised. And again, he doesn't have the money, so it's just incredible stories of God providing amazing amounts of money to buy plots of land, near the Mumbles in Swansea, beautiful old estate houses, and just incredible stories of Rees on a Saturday when all the workmen are due to be paid, and he's waiting for the last post, and God just bringing through money. And these amazing buildings go up, these amazing estates go up, and he's able to open the Bible School of Wales, which is really significant for us as well as a church. For some of our leaders have been there. And
there are some amazing stories of things they pray about at the Bible School of Wales. Can you kind of give us an example of something that because they seem to take very seriously now, not merely just the praying for local needs, but they take very seriously the praying for kind of national or international events.
Yeah, they really do. So they set up, like we said, the school for missionaries' children. By the time Rees Howells has died, we'll get to that later. They've got a prep school, they've got a secondary school. They are really doing an incredible thing in the local area. But I think we've got to remember now as well. So they've been to Africa, they've come back.
It's the 1930s now.
We're in the 1930s now, so we're starting to think wider context. Okay, wow, there is a lot happening in Europe at this time, and they really do. They really take this very, very seriously. And I think again, for me, reading this story, you've got to think I was 19 years old. I'd come to All Nations Church and really felt God had put me here because I used to pray as a teen and say, Lord, I just want to be involved in whatever you're doing in the world. I want to be involved in reaching nations. And so I'm reading it in this context. I'm reading Rees Howells' understanding of what prayer is, that he as a man in Wales with his friends in his college, that they could pray for things going on at the national and international level and have a real impact.
Yeah.
Just think that's incredible, and I think that's something that's stuck with me, that I practice, that I do. I'm regularly praying for different nations or praying for leaders of the world, and you think, what effect can you have? Well, read this book.
Yeah, because he meets the Emperor of Ethiopia, doesn't he? He comes to the Bible School of Wales. Rees Howells has very strong convictions about the abdication of Edward VIII, and
he does.
Prays through things about Dunkirk and the Second World
War.
War.
The Battle of Britain.
Fascinating.
And it is, you listen to historians, you listen to the testimony of, and there's some in the book, there's testimony of generals, commanders in the army who are going, we have no clue how these things turned out the way they did. You can watch, as I have, which is probably slightly boring, lots of documentaries about the Battle of Britain, and there's this strange moment where the British commanders, the leaders of the country, going, we are going to be overwhelmed. We are going to be overwhelmed. There's no way that we can win this, and so they're amazing. There are days of national prayer and fasting called, but the college have been at this all the way through, and throughout the 30s, just praying time and again, really believing that God's going to bring about a victory. And it's not just about taking sides on nations. For Mr. Howells, for those who were in the college, they really understood that what was happening was something spiritual. Yeah. That the war that was going on was stopping the spread of the gospel throughout the nation. So that's why he was so moved by Ethiopia. And having the emperor come over. When the Italians went to invade that country, they'd started to see the gospel grow in Ethiopia. So they were really praying not just that battles be won, but so that the gospel could go out. So when it comes to the Battle of Britain, there's this amazing turning moment where suddenly the Germans just decide totally illogically, we're going to turn resources this way, and Britain is spared, and that really becomes one of the turning points of the war. And you think, there's lots of wise commanders, there were lots of brave men fighting, but at home people were doing what they could, and taking a stand in the spiritual battle that was going on. Just incredible story, such conviction.
So Rees goes to be with the Lord in February of 1950.
He does, yeah.
So he dies, he's 70, I think, when he passes
71, away. I think, yeah.
What would you say his legacy is, both for yourself and for Christians more widely?
Well, you think he left behind a really influential school, Bible College of Wales, which shut down for a time, but it's been reopened. Reopened now for us, as I mentioned earlier. We've got leaders that really felt the call of God on their lives whilst they were there. And we live in the good of their leadership, their sacrifice, their teaching today. So many missionaries have been sent out from the Bible School of Wales. But I suppose the biggest legacy is really the legacy of faith that he leaves behind, which people can access by reading his book or just by word of mouth. I've talked about some of these stories with many different people over the years, that you can really trust God to do what he says he will do. And so it's really, really important that we listen and really seek the will of God. I think that would be one of the biggest legacies in my own life, when it comes to learning to pray. And I really took away at that time, I remember it so keenly, I really took away reading about the life of Rees Howells, that I can have an impact if I would give myself to seek God and to pray, and particularly to take on, maybe not to the same degree, or just to be led in how the Lord wants to lead me, particularly in that intercessory way, to say, Lord, I'm not going to pray anything that I'm not willing to be involved in the answer to. And I think I think that's been huge on my life. It makes you really consider what I'm talking to the Lord about. It makes you really consider what his will is.
Yeah.
Because we know that if we pray according to his will, we can ask anything and it will be done for us. And you think, for me, that's become one of the big things of my own life, to say, I just want to know the will of God and to be able to obey and to be able to pray in accordance with that.
Brilliant.
So it's been left a massive mark on me, and I suppose anybody that I share with, gets to live on in that legacy. So,
well, we'd highly recommend you Norman Grubb's book, Rees Howells, Intercessor, which is available in all good second-hand Christian bookshops. And maybe online as well.
Are they going in the show notes?
Yes, here's some places you can find it if we haven't already bought all the copies ourselves.
Yeah, exactly.
But that was a great first episode of season 3.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining
Really
us,
good.
Dave. Thanks for joining us, Kier. And thanks for listening. And we really hope that you will join us for the next episode of season 3 of the All Nations Church podcast, We Could Be Heroes. And until next time, goodbye.
Bye. Beautiful.